You know that feeling when it's Monday morning, you've had a perfectly restful weekend, you slept 8 hours, you ate well, maybe you even went for a run.
Yeah, the ideal weekend.
Right. And you sit down at your desk, you open your laptop, look at your inbox, and suddenly you just feel this physical weight drop right onto your chest.
Oh, absolutely.
You are instantly exhausted, like not just tired, you feel structurally crushed. And when you finally, raise a flag to leadership, when you tell them you are drowning in a permanently gridlocked backlog, they look at you with this deep, manufactured empathy.
Right, the classic corporate nod.
Exactly. And they offer you a premium subscription to a corporate wellness app. They tell you to just focus on your resilience.
Yeah.
Have you ever been told to just take a deep breath when what you actually need is like 3 more engineers on your project?
I mean, it is one of the most maddening experiences in the modern corporate world. There is this profound, almost, tragic disconnect between the physical reality of the person doing the work and the entirely psychological vocabulary used by the executive class to describe that work.
It's infuriating because, deep down in your bones that your exhaustion isn't a lack of willpower. So welcome to the deep dive.
We've got a lot to unpack today.
We really do. Today, our mission is to orchestrate a complete paradigm shift in how you view your own career and your own exhaustion. We are diving deep into the pages of Chapter 7 of Juha Huttunen's rigorous multi-physics framework, the $9.6 trillion entropy crisis.
Such an incredible piece of work.
It is, and the goal today is to prove to you with absolute mathematical certainty that corporate burnout is not a psychological weakness.
Nope.
It is not an attitude problem. And it is certainly not a lack of the right mindset. It is a literal, quantifiable, and entirely predictable physics failure.
Yeah, and to set the stage for this, we have to connect this back to the core lesson from our last deep dive, where we explored the physics of queuing theory.
Right.
We established that any organization attempting to run at 100% utilization, where every single employee is perfectly busy every single minute of the day, inevitably creates infinite queues.
Just a complete traffic jam.
Exactly. The entire system experiences complete gridlock.
Right.
The velocity of actual work drops to absolute zero.
Right, the 100% utilization trap. That looks great on a spreadsheet, but it's just a disaster in reality. But today, we are zooming in on what happens to the human beings trapped inside that gridlock.
Right.
Because while the work doesn't just vanish.
No, it doesn't.
The market is still demanding products. The CEO is still demanding quarterly growth.
And that is exactly where the first law of thermodynamics enters the boardroom.
Okay, lay it on us.
So energy cannot be destroyed.
Yeah.
It merely changes form. Think about the kinetic energy of the market. Aggressively high sales targets, incoming client requests, new product features.
Yeah.
When a corporate system gridlocks, the kinetic energy of all those unfulfilled demands doesn't just evaporate. It converts into a crushing, invisible static force. And that force compresses directly onto the load-bearing operational nodes trapped inside the system.
And those nodes are human beings.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we really need to move from the theoretical physics of this trapped energy right into the reality of how leaders react to it. There is this vivid, almost cinematic scene early in Chapter 7 that exposes how executives fundamentally misdiagnose this crushing force.
It's such a great scene.
It really is. Let me paint a picture for you. We are back with Huttunen's archetype of the ruthless thermodynamic executive CEO 8.
Right, CEO 8.
Yeah. He is sitting in a boardroom reviewing a $500,000 budget request from his chief human resources officer.
And the context surrounding this budget request is critical here. The engineering and logistics divisions of 8's $40 billion conglomerate are experiencing a devastating 25% turnover rate.
Wow, 25%.
Yeah. His absolute best people, the senior engineers, the veteran logisticians, they are just fleeing the company. The structural integrity of his workforce is collapsing.
So the CHRO comes to 8 with a proposed solution to stem the bleeding. They want to buy enterprise licenses for a heavily marketed corporate meditation app.
Of course they do.
Right. And they want to mandate a series of resilience and mindfulness workshops across the engineering division. The CHRO literally stands in front of the CEO and says, the team is burning out under the new delivery targets. We need to help them build thicker skin and better psychological endurance.
Which is, the standard ubiquitous legacy HR playbook.
Yeah.
You observe the human node faltering under the weight of the system, so your immediate instinct is to attempt to alter the internal psychology of the node so it can quietly bear more weight.
Let me pause you right there because that kind of contradicts how so many of us try to survive the week. I mean, what is inherently wrong with a meditation app? Like, I use one. I like taking 10 minutes to breathe. It helps me focus. Why is this such a disastrous proposal in this specific context?
Because of the source of the pressure. Breathing exercises are wonderful for general well-being, absolutely. But CEO 8 flatly rejects the budget because he recognizes a fundamental category error. He completely dismantles the CHRO's premise.
Oh, it's brutal.
He says, and this is a direct quote from the text, when a structural system begins to fracture under an unmanageable physical load, engineers do not prescribe mindfulness to the load-bearing columns.
That is just a brilliant application of structural logic. Treating systemic burnout with yoga is literally like enrolling cracked concrete in a wellness retreat.
Yes.
It is structurally illiterate. The concrete isn't failing because it lacks a positive mindset. It's failing because the bridge is carrying 3 times the weight it was mathematically designed to hold.
Exactly. And he continues to berate the CHRO, stating that a structural failure is an issue of physical mechanics, not attitude. The system is mechanically crushing the workers, and the CHRO is trying to buy them a digital sound bath.
So, 8 opens his desk drawer, takes out a blank sheet of paper, and writes a 2-sentence executive directive that completely reorganizes the department. First, he immediately reassigns the CHRO to a newly created, largely symbolic role, Director of Rest and Recovery.
Which is an incredibly surgical demotion.
Totally.
He effectively strips them of all systemic design authority. They are now solely in charge of voluntary employee leisure programs. They are no longer allowed to touch the architectural design or the operational workflow of the firm.
And the second sentence dictates the parameters for the replacement CHRO. 8 demands that the incoming executive must hold a degree in mechanical engineering or biophysics. He says, you are managing physical systems, not feelings. We will hire someone who knows the difference.
What's fascinating here is that this response from 8 isn't just about protecting employee feelings or, making a philosophical point about toxic management. This is about protecting raw capital.
Right.
Hoodanen pivots entirely to the hard data here to prove that treating burnout as a psychological weakness blinds executives to the immense operational drag that is actively destroying their profit margins.
Yeah, let's look at the literal cost of this structural failure, because the financial penalty for this faulty circuit design is staggering. The text cites computational models from the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. Let's look at the cost of burnout, the actual dollars lost to absenteeism, collapsed productivity, and turnover per individual node. For hourly non-managers, it's $3,999 a year.
Huge chunk of change.
And for salaried non-managers, it's $4,257.
And as you move up the hierarchy, the cost of that node collapsing compounds radically because their structural responsibilities are wider.
Makes sense.
For middle managers, the breakdown costs $10,824. And for executives, it is a catastrophic value destruction of $20,683 per single node.
So what does this all mean for a standard enterprise of, say, 1,000 employees? Let's assume a fairly standard mix of hourly workers, managers, and directors. The math works out to over $5.04 million in sheer, unadulterated waste every single year.
$5 million.
Yeah. A parallel survey of the Canadian workforce found that for a 500-employee organization, the annual costs of burnout exceed $3.4 million. This is not a soft, subjective HR metric.
It is a multi-million-dollar penalty for bad engineering. When an executive ignores the physical limits of their workforce, when they demand infinite resilience in the face of infinite systemic friction, they are not being tough leaders.
Yeah.
They're literally setting fire to their own capital.
Now that we understand the massive financial cost of this structural failure, the text demands that we understand exactly how the human architecture physically breaks. Huttunen argues we have to completely abandon our HR jargon.
We really do.
If we want to fix the system, we have to adopt the unforgiving vocabulary of materials science.
Because the soft vocabulary we use every day, saying we are feeling stressed or needing a mental health day is scientifically insufficient. It obscures the mechanism of the injury. To diagnose the failure, we must understand the hard mechanics of deformation. We have to look at the relationship between stress, represented in physics by the Greek letter sigma, and strain, represented by epsilon.
I have to admit, until I read this chapter, I use those words completely interchangeably.
Most people do.
In casual conversation, we say, I'm stressed or I'm under a lot of strain, and we mean the exact same thing.
Yeah.
But in mechanical engineering, they are two entirely different physical concepts, right?
Precisely. They are cause and effect. Stress is defined as the internal resistance of a material to an external deforming force. It is the invisible internal pressure.
Okay.
When a physical load is applied to any material, a steel I-beam, a rubber band, or a human being, that entity naturally pushes back to maintain its shape. That internal biological or mechanical resistance is stress. It is traditionally measured in megapascals.
Let's ground that unit of measurement for the listener. What exactly is a megapascal?
Well, a pascal is a measurement of pressure. It's 1 Newton of force applied over 1 square meter. A megapascal is 1 million pascals.
Wow.
Yeah, to visualize it, imagine the crushing weight of a large African elephant balanced entirely on a small coin.
Oh my God.
That is the kind of immense structural pressure we are talking about.
Okay, so that invisible internal pushback against the elephant is stress. But stress is only half of the thermodynamic equation. The consequence of that stress is mechanical strain. If stress is the invisible pressure building up inside you, strain is the actual measurable physical deformation. It is the visible damage to the architecture.
Exactly. And engineering science measures this relationship through rigorous testing protocols. In a lab, engineers subject materials to specific vectors of physical force to see how they deform.
Okay.
Who then takes these standardized mechanical tests and maps them directly onto your daily corporate reality.
This is where the framework gets incredibly real. Let's translate these corporate testing vectors. First, there's tensile stress.
Right.
In an engineering lab, this is the force of being pulled apart. You clamp a material into a machine and stretch it in opposite directions until it violently snaps. In the corporate world, tensile strain is chronic understaffing.
Yeah.
It is taking a single human node and stretching them across multiple projects to cover headcount gaps, pulling their cognitive capacity thinner and thinner until the bond breaks.
Then you have compressive stress. In a lab, this involves placing a material between 2 heavy iron plates and pressing inward until its internal architecture completely collapses upon itself.
That sounds awful.
It is. And in the enterprise, this is bureaucratic micromanagement. It's a top-heavy hierarchy crushing the node downward with endless surveillance metrics, rigid reporting requirements, and absolutely zero autonomy. The worker is compacted.
And finally, shear stress. My personal favorite. In physics, this is the force of 2 opposing parallel forces sliding past one another, tearing the material laterally.
So painful.
At work, this is misaligned incentive structures. Imagine marketing promises a massive new feature to a client by Friday, but the legal department says you cannot release that feature until next quarter. You, the project manager, are caught in the middle. You are literally being torn in 2 different directions by opposing internal forces.
When a human material is subjected to any combination of these vectors, tensile, compressive, or shear, they go through what Hutton identifies as the telemetry diagnostics, or the 4 states of load. This is the predictable, physical progression of a worker being pushed to their absolute destruction.
Instead of just listing these out, they'll visually walk through the timeline of a worker's career under load. State 1 is elastic deformation, and this is the state where you are approaching what engineers call the yield point. Let's say the applied force of your job, the daily emails, the meetings, the targets, equals 60 megapascals.
In the state 1 operating zone, the material stretches or compresses under the load. But here is the key. Once the external stress is removed, it snaps back to its exact original shape. The node recovers perfectly.
So you work a grueling 60-hour week to launch a major product. You are exhausted. But you sleep for a weekend, you disconnect entirely, and by Monday, you bounce back to 100% capacity.
Yeah, exactly.
But here is the fatal executive error that Hutton points out. Legacy managers constantly mistake this dangerous red-lined edge, this 60 megapascals of pressure, for ideal productivity. They see the high output and assume the system is incredibly healthy and optimal.
They are completely unaware that the node is exactly 1 single unit of force away from irreversible damage. Because every material in the physical universe possesses a strict mathematical threshold known as the yield point. Which brings us to state 2, plastic deformation.
State 2, the load hits 61 megapascals. The yield point is crossed. A microscopic increase in force, maybe it's just 1 extra recurring meeting or 1 more client dumped on your portfolio, pushes the material over the edge.
And the material doesn't immediately snap in 2. To an outside observer, the worker might even look the same. but their internal molecular architecture is irreversibly altered.
It's permanent.
Yes. The damage is no longer temporary. In a human node, this manifests clinically as cognitive fatigue, emotional blunting, and the onset of systemic burnout. The biological tissue has been permanently deformed. It will no longer snap back to its original shape.
Which leads directly into state 3, and I want to connect this directly to you listening right now because this blew my mind. State 3 is the altered baseline, or residual strain. Have you ever had a massive, heavy project finally end?
We all have.
The deadline passes, the workload drops significantly, but weeks later, you still feel completely broken. You still feel a sense of dread opening your laptop even though there's hardly anything in your inbox.
This is perhaps the most misunderstood dynamic in corporate HR. The executive finally notices the employee's fatigue and lowers the workload back down to a safe 40 megapascals. They think they've solved the problem and expect the worker to be grateful and energized. But the strain does not return to zero.
Wow.
Because the internal bonds were fundamentally broken back in state 2, the material has suffered residual strain.
The baseline has permanently shifted. You no longer function properly, even under normal everyday loads. Your capacity hasn't just been temporarily depleted, it has been fundamentally destroyed by the previous load. Taking a 3-day weekend doesn't fix residual strain.
And if that altered baseline is ignored, if the manager assumes the worker is just slacking off and reapplies the pressure, you arrive at state 4, catastrophic fracture.
The breaking point.
The applied force hits 100 megapascals. The ultimate tensile limit of the material is breached.
There is no turning back. The system physically tears apart. In the corporate world, this catastrophic fracture is the clinical medical leave. It's the sudden prescription for antidepressants. It's the abrupt, unexplainable resignation of your top-tier talent who just walks out the door on a Tuesday and never comes back.
Yeah.
The executive who pushes a system to this coordinate has not optimized their workforce. They have systematically destroyed their own structural capital.
Now, mechanical deformation beautifully explains the physical crushing of matter. It explains the weight. But Huttunen argues that to see the full picture of modern corporate collapse, we must combine mechanical physics with electrical physics. The modern workplace isn't just a physical factory moving heavy boxes, it is a dynamic, high-speed information circuit.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly a little strange at first, because the text introduces the concept of the human node as an electrical insulator, what electrical engineers call a solid dielectric.
It's a brilliant metaphor, though.
It feels so weird to talk about human beings as solid dielectrics, like we're just the rubber insulation wrapped around a copper wire. But when you look at it through this lens, a mental breakdown isn't a moral failing, it's literally just a blown fuse.
To understand this, we need to understand the role of an insulator in an electrical circuit. A solid dielectric is deployed to prevent the uncontrolled flow of electric current. Its purpose is to protect the integrity of the overall system, keeping the electrical energy contained within safe parameters. A high-quality solid dielectric successfully resists thermal deterioration and has no internal structural voids.
In physics of the enterprise, the organization itself is the circuitry. The massive capital flows, the complex administrative tasks, the thousands of emails, and those infinite queues we talked about earlier that represents the electric current. That is the systemic voltage.
And the human worker's biological, cognitive, and emotional capacity acts as the protective solid insulation against that voltage. It is the worker's brain that prevents the raw chaos of the market from destroying the company. But no insulator has infinite capacity. Every solid dielectric possesses a hard, mathematically defined physical limit known as its dielectric strength.
So what happens when the systemic voltage, the infinite backlog of demands and conflicting priorities, exceeds the worker's dielectric strength?
You experience dielectric breakdown. It is sudden, it is violent, and it is utterly catastrophic. The extreme electrical field forcibly strips electrons from their atomic orbits, transforming the protective insulator into a highly conductive pathway. Current surges uncontrollably through the newly formed breach, creating a searing electric arc.
Huttunen emphasizes a terrifying distinction here, and we really need to dwell on this. There is a massive difference between gaseous dielectrics, like the air around us, and solid dielectrics, like human biology or a block of plastic.
Oh, massive difference.
When air suffers dielectric breakdown, which we observe in nature as a lightning strike, it rapidly recovers its insulating properties the moment the voltage dissipates. The storm passes, the voltage drops, and the air heals instantly.
But solid dielectrics are entirely different. When a solid insulator undergoes breakdown, it is permanently damaged. The electrical arc physically burns through the material, leaving it carbonized, hollowed out, and structurally annihilated.
Carbonize.
Yes, you cannot recover a carbonized insulator. It must be completely replaced.
So how do these two forces interact? We have the mechanical crushing we discussed earlier, the compressive and shear stress, and now we have this searing electrical voltage of information overload. Huhtinen calls the interaction between the two electromechanical coupling, and he describes it as the ultimate lethal convergence.
Advanced multiphysics simulations demonstrate that mechanical stress and dielectric breakdown do not operate in isolation. They are intimately coupled.
Okay, walk us through it.
Let's walk through the mechanism. When a solid dielectric system, the human worker, is placed under continuous mechanical load, like years of bureaucratic micromanagement or chronic understaffing, it undergoes that physical strain we talked about. This continuous mechanical strain creates microscopic structural deficiencies inside the person. Tiny internal voids, invisible fissures, deep compositional defects.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand this perfectly. Are you saying that being micromanaged for 3 years actually creates physical structural cracks in my cognitive capacity?
Metaphorically and neurologically, yes. The mechanical fatigue degrades your biological architecture. And here is the fatal interaction. Those microscopic fractures act as stress concentration points. They radically amplify the local electrical field.
This is the exact mechanism of structural failure. This is the aha moment of the entire framework for me, because it explains a phenomenon I think we have all experienced. Have you ever had a day where you receive an email, just a standard routine request, something you've handled 100 times before, and suddenly you just break down?
Absolutely.
You start crying, or you slam your laptop shut and you feel like you just can't go on?
Yes. And you ask yourself, why did this one email break me?
Exactly. And the answer is electromechanical coupling. An electrical voltage, a volume of emails, or a project deadline that you could easily handle yesterday will trigger a catastrophic breakdown today simply because you have been mechanically exhausted over a long period of time.
The mechanical crushing creates the invisible cracks. The electrical voltage exploits those cracks. The system burns down.
And this isn't just a clever engineering metaphor designed to sound smart. The text connects this literal physics breakdown directly to the World Health Organization's clinical definition of burnout. The WHO formally classifies burnout not as a medical condition, but as an occupational phenomenon resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed.
According to the WHO, burnout is characterized by 3 dimensions: profound energy depletion, increased mental distance or cynicism related to one's job, and a severe reduction in professional efficacy.
Right.
If you map that onto Huttunen's framework, it is the literal point-for-point description of a solid dielectric losing its ability to insulate itself from organizational friction. An electrical arc of pure stress burns through the individual, leaving them carbonized, cynical, and hollow.
But all of this raises a really fascinating and, frankly, somewhat uncomfortable question. If this systemic voltage and electromechanical coupling eventually destroys every solid dielectric, why do some incredibly toxic managers seem completely immune to burnout?
Oh, that is the question.
We all know this guy, the boss who thrives in the absolute friction and chaos, who is sending aggressive emails at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, CCing the CEO, and constantly demanding to know why everyone else is so weak and can't keep up. Are you telling me physics explains why this guy is ruining my weekend?
It absolutely does. This raises an important question. When diagnosing systemic voltage, the thermodynamic architect will inevitably encounter this localized anomaly. Huhtinen calls it the superhuman node.
Superhuman node.
Legacy executives love to point to this individual. They praise their ironclad resilience, they give them promotions, and they ask why the rest of the workforce can't emulate their stamina.
But Huhtinen says this is a catastrophic misreading of the telemetry. We are not looking at a resilient employee. We are looking at the psychopathic conductor.
To understand the psychopathic conductor, we have to look at what makes an insulator work. In organizational multiphysics, human traits like empathy, psychological safety, and social cohesion act as the biological equivalent of intermolecular bonds. They are the structural elements that allow a human node to elastically absorb, process, and actually care about the outcome of the system and the well-being of their colleagues.
But an individual demonstrating dark triad traits, clinical sociopathy, narcissism, or psychopathy, is biologically devoid of these bonds.
Exactly.
Because they lack empathy, they literally do not internalize the sheer strain of conflicting demands or the emotional weight of a failing system. They don't feel the pressure because, at a biological level, they simply do not care about the collateral damage.
However, remember the first law of thermodynamics. The crushing energy of that gridlocked system must go somewhere, it cannot be destroyed. Because a sociopathic node lacks the internal resistance to absorb the heat, they act as a perfect conductor.
They don't absorb the systemic voltage. They ruthlessly transmit it right through themselves. They survive that 100% utilization trap by violently venting all of their mechanical strain directly onto their subordinates, their peers, and their external partners.
They do not burn out because they're using the surrounding human network as their personal thermal heat sink. They stay cool by burning everyone around them.
So when an executive praises this person's resilience and hustle, what are they actually praising?
They are praising a parasitic short circuit. That node is not resilient. It is simply melting every other component in its blast radius to keep its own internal temperature perfectly stable.
That is just, it completely reframes every toxic workplace environment I've ever seen. That guy isn't a superstar, he's a structural liability. Now, to prove that this isn't just theory confined to a single office building, Huttunen scales this electromechanical failure all the way up to a macroeconomic level. We're going to look at a system-wide dielectric breakdown.
Yes. We are going to examine the macro case study of the SOTE collapse. And before we dive into this data, we must explicitly state a warning to you, the listener. We are looking at this government healthcare initiative purely as a structural and thermodynamic engineering case study.
Exactly.
We are strictly avoiding any political commentary on the merits of central planning versus localized municipal models. This is an evaluation of physics, mass, and energy, nothing else.
Strictly physics. We are not taking sides here. We are looking at the structural integrity of a grid. So, let's look at the Finnish SOTE reform. Historically, Finland's health and social services were managed locally by individual municipalities. It was a highly fragmented system, but it was highly localized. On January 1st, 2023, the national government executed a massive administrative consolidation, abruptly transferring all responsibility to 21 newly established well-being services counties.
The theoretical objective, as stated by the planners, was the optimization of resources. But the practical execution was a masterclass in manufacturing extreme systemic friction without injecting any new exergy.
Okay, we need to stop and define exergy thoroughly, because if you just say the maximum useful work possible during a process that brings a system into equilibrium, my eyes are going to glaze over.
Fair enough.
Let's make this tangible for the listener. Imagine exergy as the actual healing power of a hospital.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. In the context of a national healthcare system, exergy represents actual, tangible clinical capacity. It is not the administrative paperwork, it is not the time spent in the waiting room, and it is not the budget meetings. Exergy is the exact minute a doctor's stethoscope touches a patient's chest.
Right.
It is the absolute number of diagnostic hours, surgical interventions, and direct patient care hours provided by frontline workers. Everything else is essentially friction.
And the central planners fundamentally failed because they radically altered the administrative network, introducing massive centralized IT hierarchies, which, as we know, is compressive strain, and simultaneously slashed 8.4 million euros in personnel budgets in regions like North Savo, which is a massive tensile strain.
Crucially, they apply this extreme mechanical load without adding any new exergy. They consolidated care networks, which mathematically increased travel times for both patients and mobile nurses.
Oh, wow.
They forced uniform IT systems that replaced highly efficient, localized workflows. This introduced massive friction at the exact point of care.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, the aging demographic of the nation meant the true inbound voltage, the sheer volume of sick patients, was relentlessly increasing.
Let's walk through the how of this failure. Let's look at a day in the life of a hypothetical nurse in North Savo. Yesterday, charting a patient's vitals took her exactly 2 minutes on a localized system she knew by heart. Today, because of the new centralized IT system, which was sold to the public as an optimization, she has to log into 3 different national portals, authenticate her identity twice, and select from rigid drop-down menus that don't even match her patient's specific symptoms. That 2-minute task is now a 15-minute ordeal.
And that 13-minute gap per patient is the exact mechanism of structural collapse. That is 13 minutes where exergy is destroyed and converted into pure systemic friction.
So you have soaring systemic voltage and radically reduced clinical capacity. Where does all that trapped kinetic energy go? Because the executive administrative layer was totally gridlocked by managing these software migrations, the systemic voltage bypassed management entirely. It grounded itself directly into the frontline nurses and doctors.
Imagine being the biological shock absorber for a structurally broken national grid.
Yeah.
The nurses were stretched to cover unfilled positions, effectively doubling their patient ratios. They are simultaneously crushed by the strict compliance demanded by the rigid new IT reporting structures, destroying the actual time available for patient care.
The system ordered these human nodes to absorb a voltage that vastly exceeded their thermodynamic limit, and the dielectric insulation shattered. And we aren't just using dramatic physics language here. The breakdown of the circuit manifested as violent dielectric arcs across the entire national grid.
The workers intuitively sensed the imminent permanent destruction of their biological capacity.
Yeah.
To save themselves from carbonization, they severed their connections to the network. Major trade unions issued escalating strike warnings. Mass walkouts paralyzed care homes. The breakdown of labor mediations in early 2026 was the literal electrical arc of a national circuitry burning to the ground.
Look at the quantifiable data. A rigorous analysis of the practical nurse demand projected a devastating shortage. A highly manageable shortage of 309 nodes violently spiked to a catastrophic shortage of 3,553 nodes in a single year.
That exponential spike is the exact statistical signature of dielectric breakdown. A network mathematically engineered to treat and repair biological nodes was instead actively mass-inducing structural failure within its own circuitry. When the laws of physics are ignored by the planners, the system inevitably burns.
So, what does this all mean? The diagnosis is incredibly severe. Whether you are running a 1,000-person logistics firm or a national healthcare grid, ignoring physics destroys your capital and your people. But the text doesn't just leave us in the ashes. Hutunen provides a clear, non-negotiable architectural blueprint for leaders to prevent the total destruction of their capacity.
He calls it the Voltage Regulation Protocol. These are the mandatory executive actions required to stabilize any failing grid.
So how do we fix it? Do we send out an employee engagement survey to see how everyone is feeling?
Absolutely not. That is the first protocol. Stop measuring satisfaction. Employee engagement surveys and subjective satisfaction scores are entirely useless preventative tools. They are trailing indicators.
Because it's too late.
Exactly. By the time an employee reports profound dissatisfaction on an annual HR survey, their dielectric insulation is already heavily carbonized. They are already updating their resume and preparing to resign.
Instead, you must track systemic voltage in real time. You have to measure the exact mathematical ratio of demands to resources. Track the inbound voltage, like the length of processing queues, the number of conflicting KPIs, the sheer number of required administrative touchpoints. Measure the raw hours. If a worker exceeds 50 hours a week, their burnout risk spikes. At 60 hours, the probability of breakdown escalates exponentially.
And you must measure the dielectric insulation, role economy, clarity of objectives, and total active headcount. When the demand voltage mathematically exceeds the resource insulation for more than a single quarter, the executive must manually trigger a circuit breaker, halt low-priority initiatives, reroute the current. If you do not reduce the voltage manually, the physics of the system will reduce it automatically through the catastrophic failure of your personnel.
Okay, but what about the actual daily tasks? We can measure hours, but what if those hours are spent doing useless paperwork like our Finnish nurse?
That requires the second protocol. Execute the drag audit. You must aggressively hunt down and eliminate the tasks generating heat but zero exergy. Every administrative procedure, software reporting requirement, and overlapping approval matrix acts as electrical resistance within the circuit.
If a senior manager institutes an approval process that delays project execution by 3 weeks just so they can feel important, that manager has introduced massive compressive strain. If a newly deployed software system increases the baseline data entry burden for frontline workers, it is fundamentally defective and must be ripped out. You must protect the human node's cognitive bandwidth at all costs.
The third protocol is perhaps the most ruthless, but mathematically necessary. Fire executives who destroy dielectrics. We talked earlier about the $20,683 replacement cost per executive node. The most dangerous individual in any organization is the manager who successfully hits their quarterly financial targets by structurally annihilating their own team.
The psychopathic conductor we discussed earlier. They drive their localized subsystems to 110% utilization, they strip out all the slack, and they use intimidation to push the human nodes far past their yield stress point. They get a short-term spike in output, they get their bonus, but the department's dielectric strength is permanently destroyed. The replacement costs vastly exceed whatever marginal gains they achieved.
Treating this behavior as aggressive leadership or high performance is a catastrophic failure of management. It's an architectural crime. If a leader cannot hit a target without burning out the human nodes, they are technically incompetent and must be removed from the network immediately. Sever their connection to the grid before they melt the entire division.
But wait, what about efficiency? Don't we need to be lean?
That leads to the fourth protocol, engineer slack. Efficiency, when pushed to its absolute limit, is the enemy of resilience. The myth of the perfectly lean organization must be abandoned entirely.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, and back to Kingman's formula from our previous discussions, a system subjected to dynamic, unpredictable loads must possess shock absorbers. Slack is not laziness. It is not wasted payroll. It is the vital thermal buffer that prevents the system from overheating during a sudden demand surge. Operate strictly below 85% capacity. That remaining 15% margin is the bandwidth required for complex problem-solving, innovation, and biological recovery.
And finally, the fifth protocol. Eradicate resilience training for systemic failures. Immediately cancel all corporate wellness initiatives, mandatory yoga retreats, and meditation subscriptions that are deployed as remedies for structurally heavy workloads.
When an organization faces systemic gridlock and dangerously high voltage, offering an overwhelmed worker a mindfulness application is deeply insulting. It signals that leadership is either profoundly ignorant of structural mechanics or actively gaslighting the workforce. If well-being is collapsing, fix the system of work. Address the cold engineering reality. The voltage is simply too high.
Hutton leaves us with a specific, highly memorable analogy to summarize this entire framework. Trying to cure burnout with mindfulness is like investigating the personality of cucumbers to find out why they turned into sour pickles, completely ignoring the vinegar barrels they were submerged in.
You cannot alter the physical properties of the cucumber to resist the vinegar through positive thinking.
No.
You have to change the environment. You have to drain the barrels.
Exactly. The environment dictates the structural outcome.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over today. We've talked a lot about physical limits, structural failure, and carbonization. But what if your own feelings of burnout, your exhaustion, your deep cynicism about your job, what if they aren't a sign that you are weak? What if they aren't a sign that you are failing at your career? What if, instead, they are the perfect biologically sound response of a highly functioning sensory node accurately detecting a structurally failing system? What if your exhaustion is the truest, most accurate data point your company has?
It is a profound reframing of the worker's experience. The ultimate duty of the executive is not to inspire endless endurance in the face of structural failure. The duty of the executive is to design a structure that does not require infinite endurance to survive.
Next time we reach the finale of our deep dive, we'll explore scaling a network without collapsing, the end of organizational alchemy, and the ultimate case study of Steve Jobs acting as Maxwell's demon. But for now, look at your workplace through the lens of physics. Remember, you are not cracked concrete. Don't let them send you to yoga. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.